This is Kimberly Fitzgerald, Historic Preservation Officer and City Archaeologist for the City of Salem. What I'm going to be speaking about today is archaeological compliance coordination, which is my job to help city staff and contractors who are responsible for managing projects that require archaeological compliance. Here in Salem, we protect archaeological resources through our local clearance review process. The City of Salem became a certified local government in 1986. This is a program through the National Park Service. Luckily, we've been able to take advantage of the CLG grant program over the years and received funding nearly every year to help us fund things like development of our archaeological program. Recently, Council adopted a historic preservation plan, which was adopted as part of our comprehensive plan, and it includes a specific goal to protect our archaeological resources, and this is what primarily guides our work. Salem used to be a central gathering place for tribes in the region, and we have over 250 known archaeological resources, which are protected by our local code, but also by state and federal law as well. There are many laws that protect archaeological sites and objects in the United States, which you can see here on your screen. A key thing to keep in mind here is that state law requires that an archaeological permit be obtained prior to any ground disturbing activity on an archaeological site. And new definitions and rules related to what an archaeological site is and when a permit is required are going to go into effect on July 1st, 2023. In addition to establishing local code and processes, one of our priorities was to develop a map for project managers to be able to use. The challenge was that state law prohibits sharing location information of archaeological sites. So we had to develop our Historic and Cultural Resources Protection Zone map so that it could be usable, but it didn't show specific sites. The map for this zone was developed in consultation with the SHPO and the tribes and encompasses not just the known archaeological sites in our jurisdictions, but also our high probability areas, where there's a high potential for resources to be encountered. My job is to help Salem project managers and contractors with archaeological compliance. I work to communicate and notify both the tribes and the SHPO of all the work within our protection zone, so that once you have crews on the ground, there are fewer surprises and delays. If a project is in our protection zone, this clearance includes an assessment of site significance and the impact of development on any potential resources there. In 2017, the first programmatic agreement was signed between the city and the SHPO to help streamline and facilitate work within the right-of-way. The flowchart here on the screen clarifies the steps a project manager who is managing a project in the right-of-way would need to take for the City of Salem right-of-way projects. If there's no known site within the area of potential effect, then only the transportation IDP would be required for work in the right-of-way. That would be the inadvertent discovery plan. I also just want to point out again that there are new rules relating to the definition of an archaeological site and when an archaeological permit is required that are going to take effect on July 1st, 2023. The definition has been changed from 10 diagnostic artifacts to 2 that would comprise an archaeological site. And then also, they've also removed the option of getting expedited review, which means obtaining a permit within 48 hours, unless it's an extreme life safety situation. So as part of my historic clearance review, I will be reviewing the proposal and recommending whether or not an archaeological permit would be required as part of the project for both these transportation projects and for the other types of projects on public property. So the second process that I wanted to go over today is for new construction on public property, not in the right-of-way. It follows a similar process, although since we don't have a programmatic agreement in place yet, like we do for the work in the right-of-way, individual clearance needs to be done for all projects on public property or publicly funded projects on private property within our cultural resource protection zone, even if the project will not be impacting a known archaeological site. Project managers, if your project is within the Cultural Resource Protection Zone and requires a city permit and is on public property or using public funds, then clearance is required prior to the issuance of any city permits requiring authorizing ground disturbing activity. There are 3 classes of clearance based upon the type of resource that may be impacted and the anticipated level of effect. I've developed a submittal checklist, which includes completion of the Historic Compliance Coordination Form, an interoffice billing form, as well as the Archaeological Clearance Form worksheet, which you can see here on your screen. If you're not familiar with the archaeological terms, you can always have your archaeological contractor complete sections 3 and in particular section 4. And you can always reach out to me if you have questions about it. Essentially what I'm trying to do is determine whether the proposed project will have an impact potentially on a known resource. So I'm going to go through an example. Here's an example. This is a development that occurred on 990 Broadway. My first step was to research. I took a look at the historic maps, primarily called Sanborn Fire Insurance maps, which you can see here overlaid over the proposed structural plan for the new building that's now currently built on the site. We were able to see that there were 3 cottages there on the northern end of the site that were constructed around World War II. And we also found that according to the map, there was a building, it's labeled here 5 apartments, more at the central where the parking lot is. And the 3 cottages on the north end were determined not to be significant. And yet, however, the building in the center we realized was constructed in 1841 and was extremely significant and eligible for the National Register as an archaeological site. So the priority was to do some testing there to determine whether or not their proposed plan would be impacting what remained of this 1841 structure. So yeah, and we had many other questions. We did some testing to determine whether the foundations were still intact from the cottages. So we worked with the developer and we completed the testing. This was in the early part of 2020, the early part of the pandemic. So we collaborated with them and this was a public archaeology project. So we were able to do the testing and we worked with them to do some minor redesign to relocate the utilities so they wouldn't impact the basement of the Jason Lee house. If you are interested, you can go to this site. There's an interpretive panel and some of the bricks we uncovered there on the site. So part of this clearance process, I will notify the SHPO and the tribes of the clearance decision and any conditions. In certain cases, I'll recommend that we take the project to our monthly tribal roundtable to get clearer direction from the tribes regarding what they're interested in seeing. Once the clearance decision has been issued, I can sign off on any city permits authorizing the ground disturbing activity. I also may recommend development of a monitoring plan, which involves, if you're not familiar with it, an archaeologist on site watching the ground disturbing activity as it occurs. And I can assist with the development of a monitoring plan if needed. I've developed some field requirements and also FAQs about all of these things. So in particular, I want to touch on the inadvertent discovery plan. So this describes a protocol for contractors on site to follow in the event that artifacts are discovered inadvertently while doing ground disturbing activity. We have adopted a citywide IDP. We also have one for human remains in the event that these are inadvertently discovered. There are some cases that can't use the adopted citywide IDP and requires project-specific inadvertent discovery plans, and I would work with you on developing those. But just keep in mind that these will be attached to any permits that are issued authorizing the ground disturbing activity. So if folks ask you about it, these need to be on site during the development. So last, I'm going to recommend that if you're ever interested in volunteering for any of the City of Salem archaeology projects, we typically do one a year in the spring around April or May. And you can reach out if that's something you're interested in. I've had several city staffers help out on these projects and it's kind of fun. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about our archaeology program or any of the forms. Please reach out to me by phone or email.